All right, guys, welcome to part two. And I do apologize that the audio was not good in the second half of the first video. I think I managed to turn off my external mic somehow, so it was just like the microphone from the webcam or something. So it wasn't great, but I had already recorded that twice and I wasn't doing it again. So I apologize for that. I'm going to do my best to give you better audio in this video. So we're just going to jump into part two. Just as a recap, we went through part one, which was mostly the first episode of season 6. And remember that I am focusing almost entirely on the main arc that was going on, which is Operation Lead the Walkers Away and everything that kind of flows in and out of that. So I'm going to be skipping side missions like Here's Not Here and Always Accountable. And I'm not going to be going deep into, the individual symbolism that is in each scene or the background pieces or anything like that. I'm just mostly sticking to what's relevant here. Um, so at the end of 601, we saw that they were doing Operation Lead the Walkers Away, and it was actually going very, very well until the wolf's horn went off and pulled the back half of the herd off the road. And that's kind of where we're at. So now, of course, in episode 2, we jump over to Alexandria and what's going on there. So let's get into JSS. I'm not going to talk too much about Enid here. I am going to mention her. So, ever since this episode aired, we've always said that Enid is a Beth proxy, and there are ways in which this is very obvious. And her red jacket, which I'm going to show you in just a minute here, has been probably talked about before and even by me, but it really struck me in a different way this time, and I connected it to things I hadn't connected it before. So, basically, we see Enid's parents die at the beginning, and that leaves her on her own. And then after they die at some point, she comes up to a car that has a young man lying here on the ground, and he appears to be dead. She grabs his arm to drag him away from the car because she wants to stay in the car for the night. And he wakes up and reanimates. So clearly he's like one of the dormant walkers, and she wakes him up. But then we see her kill him. And then the next thing after that, he's lying next to the car. This is when he reanimates, a better look at him. You can see his red jacket here, right? The next thing we see, he's lying next to the car here, and he doesn't have his jacket. So that is because, she killed him and then she took his jacket. And we can see here on the sleeve that she's wearing it. So obviously, this is just a jacket that's in good condition. She was probably cold. Um, but here's the thing, and I will talk about this more when we get to 603, which won't be too long from now. There have been several times throughout the series where we've seen something similar to this. It's usually a young person, often a man, but usually blonde, wearing red, and there's often something about them having been left behind, and it's very clearly a proxy to Beth. So we have all of those instances, and we have Enid here, and then remember the red garment, whether it was a cloak or a coat or whatever it was, in Beth's cell. So all I'm saying is that anytime someone, especially a young person, puts on a solid red jacket, or mostly red, mostly solid, I guess I should say, and I'm sure this could extend probably even to a blanket or a cloak or a shirt, as long as it's very prominent and not covered up by anything else. They've just named themselves as a Beth proxy. And the reason I'm going to talk about this more when we get to 603 is because we see one of these in 603. So this is basically Enid naming herself a Beth proxy. And then, of course, we have other things like the turtle later on and all of that. But the other thing here is that when she's in this front seat, she puts the letters JSS on the window, right? That's what we're seeing her doing. And the way that they do this shot of her looks exactly like the shot of 509, which is Tyrese's death episode, right? And the walker that wakes up in the front seat. So they're definitely coding her as a Beth proxy here. And I do have to wonder about the turtle. This is a little bit of an aside, but I don't even know if the turtle was a symbol or a Beth symbol before season 4. It may have been. I don't remember there being much turtle symbolism before that, but it almost feels like it started with the story of the little turtle that Emily liked and Norman saved from the fire for her. And fans made such a big deal about that. And also, I do think they told that story because it could have been Gimple introducing the turtle symbolism and wanting to draw attention to it. But I even wonder if this was even a symbol before that, And so I just feel like the turtle is very much Beth and Daryl symbolism. Um, Anyway, so the point is, it's very clear that Enid is a Beth symbol, is a Beth proxy, I guess I should say, and we're going to come back to that, okay? All right, so what's going on in this episode? Obviously, the wolves are going to show up. The Enid stuff was a little bit of a flashback to her before she got to Alexandria. Um, we meet Denise for the first time here. We see Carol making food, talking to the other lady in the other ladies in the pantry. Of course, just kind of Carol being Carol. And then, of course, the wolves attack and start killing people. Um, we have Sam and Jesse hiding in the closet. Enid goes to see Carl where he is with baby Judith. And we're going to talk about that a little bit too. Okay, the next proxy we have to recognize here is that Carl and Enid together are a Beth and Daryl proxy, kind of like Sasha and Abraham are. Now, not only is this true because Enid has already named herself a Beth proxy, and notice that she is wearing the red jacket again here. Okay, so there's a direct tie between seeing her put on the red jacket in the flashback, which is before the opening credits, and seeing her put it on here. Um, but then in this scene too, she comes in and tells Carl she's leaving. I came to say goodbye. I'm not staying. And he basically forces her to stay and says, no, no, you're staying. You're going to help me protect Judith. You're not going out there. Um, I'll come back to that one. But at this point, he says, don't tell me goodbye. And she says, okay, I won't. Which is her saying, I'm still going to leave, but if you don't want me to tell you goodbye, I won't. And that is um, definitely a kind of reworking of Beth's I hate goodbyes, right? And the fact that Daryl wasn't able to tell her goodbye. So once again, these two are a Beth and Daryl proxy, but there is one other really interesting thing about Enid here. Um, this right here. She says, and I'd forgotten about this, even though people talked about it when it was on, and then I was rewatching it going, wow, we never figured out what that was. So she says, she's talking about Alexandria, and she says, this place is too big, it's too hard to protect, there are too many holes or like blind spots, I think she says. And then she says, that's how we were able to, and then Carl cuts her off. We don't know what she was going to say there, and it's really weird. There were people who, when this aired, thought that she was one of the wolves, thought that she was an imposter and had scouted for them. And so because when she says we, it's almost like she is associating herself with these people who are attacking. Now, obviously, nothing ever came of that. She was not a wolf. Enid wasn't, and she stays on the show for a long time until she gets killed with whispers. Um, so none of that was the case, but it's like, what was she about to say here? Like, I honestly don't know the answer to that. And me and my fellow theorists talked about it. We don't know. Like, nobody has any massive, oh, this is what it was. We don't know. But we did talk about that maybe she and her parents could have come out of the CRM. And she's like saying that she was in a situation where she knows from experience that it's hard to protect a big place like this. That sort of thing. Again, we just don't know. It's really interesting. So it's one of two things. Either they were hinting at something like maybe Enid coming out of the CRM or some other group that will make a little bit more sense later on. And I don't think it necessarily has a whole lot to do with Enid. It's not like um, anybody's really looking for that in terms of her character. But, maybe it'll just make sense later on. Or this is something symbolic. And if it's symbolic and she is a Beth proxy, then it has to do with Beth. And I don't know what it means, but it's interesting. So it's just something to keep in mind because it's kind of a question mark. We don't know the answer to this and it's weird. Okay, so the truck runs into the church, the horn blares. We see, bullets. This is from Spencer actually shooting at the truck. But when the horn blares, of course, that is what is pulling the Walker herd off the road several miles away where Rick is. But Morgan shows up. Remember that Rick sent him back to Alexandria to tell everyone what was going on, and he didn't quite make it before the wolves got there. But Morgan turns off the horn. Spencer and Deanna stay on the outside because they don't know how to fight, and it's mostly going to be Carol and Morgan versus the wolves. Of course, Jesse does kill the woman in her kitchen. With the scissors. Now, this is going to end up being a really important detail. It's something that we definitely pounced on back when this aired because Jessie is blonde and then there's the scissors, right? The scissors are a Beth thing and she kills someone with them. So it just felt very Coda-like, right? But you have to wonder why Gimple put this in. It's kind of like what I said in the last video about the sign that said 5 Quint on it. It's like, yeah, that does feel like it's a callback to season 5, and so does this because of the scissors and someone's being stabbed with scissors. But why just put these random symbols in, like, hey, here's a blonde with scissors. I mean, that there's not a lot of logic in that, right? So is it just because Jesse happens to be blonde, he decided to have her kill someone with scissors? That it doesn't seem like quite enough to me, right? There has to be a reason in the narrative that he wanted to put in this detail. Because if it was just a dramatic, gnarly scene where Jesse steps up and kills somebody to protect her kid, he could have done that with a gun or a knife or a machete or anything else, right? The scissors are obviously purposely placed. And I don't think we ever really hit on why this is, but it is part of my theory now. I do have an idea of why I think he did this. So again, bear with me. I will come back to it. Um, let's keep going with the narrative. What else happens? Carol does get to the armory. She dresses up as one of the wolves, right? And uh, people start calling her Aphid. So the person she kills and then takes their clothing was named Aphid. So we see these people going, good catch, Aphid, and where'd you get the gun and all of that. We talked a lot back in the day when this aired about how the natural predator to an aphid is a ladybug. And Beth is the ladybug because she had ladybug artwork in her cell in 401. And then, of course, we saw her pick up a ladybug when she was with Daryl in Still, right? So they very clearly associated ladybug symbolism with her. So there's a good reason that when this aired, people really thought that Beth was going to be with the wolves or coming back right after them or something. And, that's not a crazy thing to think. Like, this is Beth symbolism that's being really kind of shoved in our faces with the wolves. But clearly she didn't show up in season 6. So what gives, right? We're going to get to that. Um, so it's just important to know that, I mean, symbolically, if this enemy group that is harming people, the wolves, are kind of being symbolized by an aphid, the ladybug, which is Beth, is their natural predator, which suggests that she's the one that's going to be able to overcome them or take them down in some way. And again, that clearly didn't happen in season 6 with the wolves, but this is all a foreshadow. All right. The next thing is that about 5 of the wolves, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah, survive. Morgan runs them out of Alexandria, but he doesn't kill them, right? So they do take off, but he doesn't kill them. And then the next thing we see too, that is also important, is that Aaron finds his bag with pictures in it and realizes that the wolves got a hold of his bag when he dropped it back at the wolf trap when he was with Daryl. Um, and that led them to Alexandria. Now, I have no idea how this is going to play out when it comes to Beth, and you'll see what I mean as we go along, but there is a really big recurring theme about losing a bag. And I'm not sure what the purpose of it is, but I'm going to show you that we've seen it at least 3 times. So it's obviously important. Okay. So I'll talk more about that as we get to it. Um, the other place that I saw this, it wasn't so much in this arc as in the beta arc in season 9, but I will tell you about that when we get there. Anyway, so then we also see that Holly dies. So we have this stuff with Denise and Tara. Enid leaves, and she leaves this note for Carl. She goes over the wall anyway, once it's kind of over, the wolf attack, I mean. And that's pretty much it for what happens in episode 2. So then we go to episode 3, and this is a terrible picture, but I want you to notice that the first thing we see in episode 3, I mean, first it's like a black picture and it just says horn blaring because we can hear the wolf horn blaring, but the first thing we see is Glenn running. And this really struck me because it actually feels a lot like the Beth Flash in the opening credits that were there. It was there during this time and it was there up through season 9, I think, or maybe it was 10, where she's running in her yellow polo. And the first thing we see here is Glenn running. And the reason that's important is because, as you know, Glenn is going to get the death fake out, and he is definitely a proxy for Beth in this arc in a big way. So just something I noticed is that the first thing we see is him running, and we only see him running. We don't see anybody else. So obviously this is them building up to what's going to happen in this episode, which is his death fake out. But I thought it was interesting to see him running, and it just was kind of reminiscent of that flash in the opening credits. So when we come to episode 3, Rick, Michonne, and Glenn's group all meet up. And so we have a group of, it ends up being kind of a large group, right? Because there's Rick, Michonne, Glenn, and then there's Annie, Scott, Keith, and 2 other people. Sturgis is one of them. And Sturgis dies throughout the course of the episode, but Annie will die eventually too. A bunch of them do, right? So Rick wants to get the Alexandrians, especially Annie, who has been hurt and has the same injury Beth did, by the way, after she stepped in the small game trap. We saw parallels here too. She fell, and Glenn even was like helping her with an arm around her, and her arm was around his neck, exactly like Beth and Daryl did in Alone. So there was definitely some visual callbacks there. Anyway, but she's hurt, and he wants to get everyone back to Alexandria. But, obviously they have this problem of the herd, which is half of it has been pulled off the road and is heading back toward Alexandria. So they need to figure that out. And um, he comes up with a plan where he is going to run back. Let's see. This is where he's talking to Daryl, and Daryl wants to come help, and he says no. Anyway, Rick wants to go back to where the turn happened at Marshall and Redding and get in the RV. And he's going to try to get ahead of the back half of the herd who's headed toward Alexandria and lead them away again with the RV. So he's saying, if I can get to the RV and get ahead of the herd, I can lead them back. I can get them back on track and away from Alexandria. We can still salvage this, basically. So he's going to be doing the same basic thing that Sasha and Abraham and Daryl are doing, except using the RV and probably flashing lights and such, and honking his horn and all of that to get the second or the back half of the herd back to going in the right direction and away from Alexandria. That's what he's hoping to do. So at this part, he pulls Glenn and Michonne aside. Interestingly, David volunteers to go with him, and he says, "No, they're probably going to need you here. Annie's hurt. Just go with them." But then he pulls Glenn and Michonne aside and he says, "Look, probably not all of them are going to make it. And if you have to, leave them behind to make sure and get yourselves back." And neither Glenn or Michonne really like it that he says that, but he's kind of adamant, and so they just sort of leave it at that. But the thing is that Heath hears it and is pretty pissed that Rick said that, that he's going to leave their people behind. So he's not happy. At this point, they split up and go their separate ways. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the David and Betsy thing because that really has been beaten to death. Just quick overview. David is bitten at one point, and his wife Betsy is back in Alexandria. And when she finds out that he died and didn't make it back, she kills herself. So there's a lot of Beth and Daryl parallels. First of all, the first letter of the name, David, Betsy, Daryl, Beth, right? That was the first thing we jumped onto. And then the fact that she died by suicide, she actually cut her wrists. She did it differently than Beth did, but still there's a parallel there. All kinds of things, right? And then the biggest thing for me is the way that it shows his jacket here, or it's like an overshirt that he's wearing. It looks exactly like the holes in Beth's sweater, which hers are on the arm, not on the shoulder. But I think that this is purposely done so that we are getting a hint that Beth was bitten, because this is basically what the average clothing looks like when a zombie bites you, right? Bites through your clothing. And that's what they're trying to tell us. So that's the basic gist of David and Betsy. But I did make one note of something about David that he says to Michonne. She's asking how he met Betsy and everything. And he says that he met Betsy after the turn and she became his wife. So they haven't been married since before the apocalypse happened. Um, he says, "I was alone. I had lost everything. We found Betsy on the way back to the community." And this is something that I've looked at several times over the years. Clearly, it's never panned out because, Beth has not returned yet. But I can kind of say it where we are now as well. I mean, it's just something about him being away from the community, and on the way back, he finds her. So if we were to apply that to where we are with Daryl Dixon, he's out away from his community, away from his home, and maybe on the way back, that's when he finds Beth, right? I mean, and like I said, I've looked at that at several other junctures, like when Daryl was taken by the Saviors, and there's a lot of places that it might have panned out and didn't, but you guys know that we think we're closer than ever, and it seems like she's right around the corner. So I could see this really applying to where we are in Daryl Dixon right now. And basically, he's saying that he had given up on life when he met Betsy, but she still saw him as a person. After I thought I was dead and gone, she saw me, and he says she was my friend, and then she was more. I mean, it just feels like this could really apply to Beth and Daryl. And then this is the part that jumped out at me too. Finding her in all this, that was everything. This is exactly what Rick says to Daryl in 416 when they come back together, and he says, "You being here with us now, that's everything." So I think we have a lot of themes swirling around this. In the scene in 416, Daryl and Rick did talk about Beth. Okay, so she was mentioned in that scene. So this could be a callback to that scene for that reason, because she was mentioned there, and that was the "she's just gone" line, right? And now Daryl needs to find her. So you could translate it to Daryl finding Beth again, and that's everything. But it's also about a reunion after a long time between Rick and Daryl in that scene. And then, of course, because David is saying this about his wife, there's a romance element in it. So that jumped out at me. Now, I did say that there was a guy named Sturgis. I didn't get a picture of this, but he ran away from the group when they were out in the woods. He just freaked out and ran, and they didn't know where he went, right? So then they get to this little town and they start checking the cars to see if any of them will work, which they do not. Basically, the walkers are coming, and so they start having Nicholas lead them through the town because he's been through here before, back before with Aiden, when he and Aiden were running different supply runs and things. And they see Sturgis's hat, and then they end up finding him, and he's already dead, and the walkers are munching on him, right? This sequence is very similar to what happened in 4A with Sam and his girlfriend at the Apple House when Rick and Carol found them, right? Rick first found her leg, and then a little further on, he saw her body. She was on the ground. She was being eaten by walkers, and this was very similar. In this case, it was Sturgis's hat, and then they follow that a little bit further, and he's on the ground being eaten by walkers. And it just actually the shots look very similar. So I'm not even entirely sure where I'm going with that. It's just a similarity that I noticed. And I don't think that we have entirely put our finger on what the whole Sam thing means exactly. I need to look into it more and think about it more. But the point is, we're just getting that symbolism again here. So yeah, there's the gory shot of him being eaten by the walkers. Eventually, of course, they get to the pet store. Um, I won't go into tons of the symbolism that's in the pet store, but there's a lot of serious symbolism because, uh, it's a pet store. There were dogs. And so there's a lot of cages that say puppies, and there's other kinds of animals too, of course. But here, this isn't a great picture of it, but this is a huge poster of a dog. So there's a lot of serious symbolism here. And this is where Glenn comes up with a plan. He wants to burn a building to draw the walkers in, and like draw them into the town and away from Alexandria. And again, it's probably not a long-term solution, but it will buy them time so that they can get back and find another car and lead them away. Or maybe it will draw them away from Alexandria, and then from there, if Rick gets to the RV, he can lead them away. They're just all trying to figure out, what to do to keep these walkers away from Alexandria. And then Nicholas suggests a feed store because there will be a lot of dry stuff in the feed store. And he says it'll go up, really easily in flames because of how much dry stuff is in there. This is where Glenn does have a lot of Beth's dialogue. He says, we all have jobs to do, that sort of thing. So they decide to do this. Okay, then it shifts to Rick, and Rick is running by himself. Remember that Rick is going to go get the RV and try to lead the walkers away that way. And he comes upon some walkers right here that he has to put down. And it's just 3 or 4 of them. This was really hard to get a picture of. But this walker here, you can see that there is a knife through this walker's head. That's why there's a clean line down the middle of its face, but the knife is still there, right? And he cuts himself when he kills this walker. So you see he's looking at his hand, and pretty much for the rest of the episode, he keeps looking at his hand and he's favoring it. It obviously hurts. He ends up, wrapping something around it. But the point is, he hurts his hand right here. Now, in terms of the walker itself, I want to say that we've seen similar walkers to this before. I mean, we've seen them when they sometimes have metal in their heads. I know that we saw that with Abraham and Eugene at one point. And I want to say that we might have seen something like this at the big spot, but I'd have to go back and look for sure. And it's not like Rick always cuts his hand on these walkers, but I've always thought that maybe they had something to do with Beth, because at the end of the day, even though it is different, it's, a knife to the face rather than a gunshot wound, but it's still a head wound, right? And it's just the fact that they show us these kinds of walkers a lot, it always jumps out at me. In terms of Rick, so he cuts his hand, and it's a lot like when he's fighting Winslow and impales his hand on whatever it is, the nail or the spike or whatever, which everybody kind of saw as a stigmata wound, which it kind of was. But I just think that all of these are a foreshadow of him losing his hand. And keep in mind that we had one of those in 510 in them when he almost got bit by a walker just before Daryl got there. Then he cuts his hand here and he's favoring his hand and it's, continually like making a big deal about his hand. And then, of course, there's Winslow, where he also hurts his hand. So there was a lot of foreshadows of Rick losing his hand. And it's just important to know that when this was airing, we had no idea if that was actually going to happen or not. So just to show that they symbolized this quite a few times in the previous seasons, and then they did end up fulfilling it. So just another example of how it has nothing really to do with Beth and Daryl. This is a Rick thing, but they symbolize this over and over again for many seasons before it actually happens. So take that to heart, right? This is what they do. Okay. So then we go back to he's still running toward the RV, and we get this speech. This really, it's kind of an argument between Michonne and Heath, right? But this was kind of an epic speech that Michonne had that everybody really loved. And again, there's parts of it that are really jumping out at me this time around. Michonne is saying that Heath doesn't really know what it's like to be on the outside. He's still really angry because he heard Rick say that, they might be left behind. And Michonne is assuring him that that's not going to happen. She goes, look, Rick said what he said, but I'm still here. I'm not abandoning you, and nobody's getting left behind. That's not what I'm going to do. Um, and so when she says that you don't really know what it's like, he yells back at her and says, I've been doing runs from the start. I've been out there. And she just says the whole thing about, I don't know how much of this I took pictures of, but have you ever had to do things that made you afraid of yourself? Have you ever been so covered in blood that you didn't even know whether it was yours or your best friend's or Walker's? And, all of that. And she says, if you have not experienced that, doing runs is fine, but if you've never experienced that, then you really don't know. And anyway, at one point he says, basically that they don't leave people behind. That's not how they do things. See, this is not how we do it. And she says, that's because you've never had to do it before, basically. Sometimes you don't have a choice. You've never had to do it any other way. And like I said before, when I was talking about episode 1, 2, there's a lot of talk about leaving people behind. And it has a lot to do with the callbacks to something that happened in season 5. And of course, well, I mean, I was going to say maybe this one's a little bit more obvious to the general audience, but maybe it's not, because the general audience assumes that Beth was buried, and we saw Tyrese get buried, and that's not true. That Beth was buried, I mean. So my point is, think about what Michonne is saying here. Think about what she's emphasizing here. He says, we would never leave somebody behind. He's kind of on his high horse a little bit here, understandably, because, we agree with him that you shouldn't leave people behind. But that's what he's saying to Michonne. We would never do that. That is not the way we do things. And she says, because you've never had to. You've never been in a position where you absolutely had to leave someone behind or make a terrible choice about leaving one person behind to save somebody else, right? That's kind of what she's saying. And this whole thing about being so covered in blood that you don't even know whose blood it is. Okay, that could be a very general statement about fighting walkers, for sure. But when did we actually see that with Michonne? We really haven't. I mean, we've definitely seen points where she and others in the group have fought walkers and been covered with blood. But what is she referring to here? I don't know what specifically she would be referring to here. I mean, when she fought, I'm just trying to think the times she fought walkers, right? After the prison fell, there was that time when she, got some more pets and was kind of in her trauma and ended up killing all the walkers. But she knew very well that that was walker's blood. She wasn't like worried that was the blood of somebody that she loved, right? And you know what I mean? So it's like, you've got to think about what they're saying here. And I'm telling you, this is a callback to stuff that happened during the missing 17 days. Obviously, it has to do with leaving Beth behind, the fact that they had to leave her behind. And, we do believe they went back for her. They couldn't find her, but it would still have been a really difficult decision. And if Daryl is, freaking out about it and going totally apeshit about it, that's going to affect other people in the group who also care about him. And then this whole blood thing. I mean, I've told you guys before, I think there's a lot more that went down during the missing 17 days than we actually know about. So this is another clue to that. And it's like, what is Michonne talking about here? Like, what is she referring to? What is she thinking about as she's saying this? We don't know because we haven't seen it. right? So this is a really interesting conversation. And again, they're emphasizing leaving people behind. It's like a whole theme about leaving people behind, not leaving them behind. Should you leave them behind? Do you sometimes have to leave them behind? And that has to pertain to something they recently went through. Okay. Okay. So here is the red coat walker that I told you about. Um, Nicholas and Glenn find him when they're heading toward the feed store. He's a young man. Nicholas says his name is Will. Sorry for the gore in this picture, but just so that you can see the red coat. And of course, he is missing an eye. So unlike Enid, right, who is alive, this is actually a serious symbol too, and he's wearing the red coat. So identical jacket to Enid's, and Nicholas says this young man was very young, like 19, which is basically Beth's age, when we saw her in season 5. And he and Aiden left this young man behind. He was part of their crew. He was Nicholas's friend, but they were trying to we know that, at the end of season 5, really, it was established that Aiden and Nicholas were doing runs. They were quite cowardly. They were leaving people behind. They were sacrificing people for their own safety. So, this is just a callback to that. And Nicholas is trying to change. So um, now, obviously, we don't think that that is exactly what happened with Beth, that they left her behind and were cowardly. That's not Team Family. But um, there are other parallels here, right? The fact that the walker is missing an eye, he's a serious symbol, the red jacket, and he was left behind by his crew. There's also the proximity to the car. I mean, if you think about it, and I didn't get a picture of this, but he is lying next to a car, like he might have just fallen out of it or tripped and fallen down next to it. But there was the young man that Enid took the jacket from, and he was lying as though he'd just gotten out of a car. So it really almost seems like both of them just stumbled out of the front seat of a car. And that feels like a Beth thing too. If she was left in the car, and then remember Enid, when she was writing JSS on the window, it looked like 509, which is where the walker wakes up in the front seat. I mean, there's just so much symbolism packed into all of this. So you get the idea. The point is, anytime we see this, it's clear that it's a Beth symbol or a Beth proxy. And I don't remember all of the times we've seen the red jacket, but I know that we've seen it other times and I've pointed it out. And most of the times they were probably really small side things. It wasn't quite as front and center as we see it here. But I know that we've seen it other times. They have used this symbolism multiple times. Okay, so Rick finally gets to the RV. It's got the yellow balloons tied to it. And this is right at the part where they turned the herd. Remember, we got all this because these are these are walkers that were trampled when they were trying to turn, which they did. So he's running back to this point. He's going to like go around the wall to where the RV is. He finally gets in. You notice that his hand is still hurt and bleeding, but he drives away. Once again, remember that he's trying to get ahead of the herd, the half that broke off, and is headed toward Alexandria so he can lead them away again. All right. So then we see David and the others in the pet shop writing notes to their loved ones on cashier paper. Then they start hearing like a banging noise from behind this serious poster. I guess it's not a serious poster, it's a dog poster, but it's a serious symbol. Um, and the problem is that the herd is coming into the town behind them. And so I think their original plan was to let the herd kind of pass them by. And then Michonne is going to take the rest of these people. And we have injured people here. So there's Annie who's injured, and David who's been bitten, so Glenn and Nicholas left to start the feed store on fire, and with the hopes that that will pull the walkers toward the feed store, which is like on the other side of this little town. And once they're gone, Michonne can take the injured and the rest of these people back to Alexandria. Well, when they start hearing this banging coming from the closet, that's going to attract walkers who are outside, and then they're going to be trapped in the pet store. So that's a bad thing. So this is why they have to take care of this. So, Michonne rips down the poster. There's a little closet behind it. And it's just some people who were in there who died. And there's like 2 or 3 walkers in there, and she takes care of it. But they make a whole bunch of noise. So we have the first of these, it's not the whole herd yet, but they immediately turn toward the pet store because they heard the noise. And now they've got walkers banging on the doors and windows of the pet store. And then the herd comes through, and suddenly they're in a lot of trouble. They're not going to be able to get out. They're going to be trapped here, right? And all of that is a problem. See, he's saying they, meaning the walkers, know we're in here now. We're not going to be able to wait them out. So this just really messes with Michonne's plans, right? It's like, nothing can quite go right. Then she says the herd it's going to be here any minute, and it's like when she looks out the window, the herd is right there. It's coming. It's like 20 feet away. So of course, they have to open the door and fight their way out, and this is where they do that. But unfortunately, along the way, Annie is killed. She trips and falls and gets eaten. Meanwhile, Nicholas and Glenn are looking for the feed store, but this is one of the biggest things that jumped out at me that I think is really interesting that I really truly don't know the answer to yet. And that is that the feed store has already burnt down. It's not there. And it's not just that they can't burn it or something. This clearly was a fire. Like it already burnt down. So I'll talk about some ideas about what I think this means symbolically, but just notice that how strange this is because clearly, I mean, you would think that it would be a callback to Beth and Daryl burning down the Moonshine Shack, especially because Glenn is a Beth proxy and has a bunch of her lines. But we saw the burning of the Moonshine Shack. We saw that happen. And this happened off camera at some past point. When Glenn got there, it was already burnt. And so that messed with their plan. And they couldn't do what they wanted to do to lead the walkers away. Um, Again, I'll talk a little bit more about some ideas I have about what this might mean, but I also don't have a 100% firm theory on it. It could just be a callback, but you know how it is. Like Gimple never really does a simple callback. It's got to be more than that. But the point is, they can't now use this to start the fire and draw the herd toward them, but the herd is coming. It's already arriving even now as they're arriving at the herds at the feed store. And now they don't know what to do. Now they're finding themselves surrounded, right? So they have to run. We see Michonne, again, because of the action and how fast this is moving, some of these shots are really hard to get, but this is when Michonne and the group try to go over the gate. All of them make it except David. He was already bitten anyway, but this is where he dies, unfortunately, in a really horrible way. Um, and then, you know, Michonne does make it over, but it's tense for a minute. Meanwhile, Nicholas and Glenn are running. They hit the dead end. They get up on the dumpster. And of course, this is where um, Nicholas kills himself. You know, he says thank you, which is a callback to what he said in the first episode when he thanked Glenn for um, believing in him, basically, and giving him a shot. So this is actually really tragic that he says that this right here and then kills himself. And then, of course, they fall off the dumpster, and we have the whole, you know, it looks like Glenn is being eaten and the whole death fake out for Glenn. Meanwhile, the only ones to survive in Michonne's group is her, Heath, and Scott, basically, which is Sasha's husband in real life, right? They're the only ones that survive in her group. Um, and by now, Scott is hurt. His foot is hurt, and so they're having to help him. Um, so this part is really interesting too, and I'm going to come back to this. It's the missing smoke. So I kind of have these in the wrong order, but Michonne turns around. Glenn, I don't even think I emphasized this when I was telling it to you, but Glenn does tell her the smoke will draw the walkers in. And, you know, if I get stuck outside, I'll find some way to let you know I'm okay. She's waiting for this fire to start. And of course, she has no idea that Glenn and Nicholas got to the feed store and it wasn't there and they couldn't burn it down. So she's looking for the smoke, and that's why it shows this horizon. There's nothing there. There's no smoke, and she's thinking, why didn't they burn it down? Why are we not seeing any smoke? Then we have Heath, who actually, you know, kind of tries to comfort her a little bit. He says there's no smoke, but that doesn't mean they didn't make it. He can tell that's what she's worried about. I'm really connecting this heavily back to season 4, and it does have everything to do with the Moonshine Shack. And that's why, you know, there's more to think about here that we need to figure out, because after the Moonshine Shack burned, we had Carol and Lizzie and Mika specifically talking about that smoke, and there was a lot of emphasis put on the smoke. They would say, if the smoke is black, that means it's still burning, but once the smoke is white, it means the fire is out. But we had the other characters that could see that smoke, right? And now this is a very powerful callback to that, and the fact that they're not seeing the smoke, and the signal isn't there. And now she's worried that something has happened to Glenn, right? And, you know, I have to go back to the weirdness of, you know, here in this arc, the feed shop already having been burnt down. I mean, who burnt it? This place is not that far from Alexandria, so you would think if there was a big fire. Let's go back to that picture. You would think if there was a big fire that the Alexandrians would have seen the smoke. And this is burnt, but there's nothing else in the town that is burnt. It's not like you have a whole city block that's burnt. It's only this building. That's weird. So who burnt it? Why didn't the Alexandrians know about it? And then I thought, when did it happen? Did it happen before Nicholas and Aidan were out? But if that's the case, Nicholas would have known about it. The last he saw, this place was still standing and he knew what it was. So who burnt down this feed shack and why? It's really, really strange. And we never really get any kind of answer for it. It's just the circumstance that leads to Glenn being on the dumpster and having the fake out, the death fake out, right? Um, so it's very strange, but again, I don't think that it is just that circumstance or something they made up and contrived for that reason. I think that it is very symbolic. So again, I will come back to it. So then we go back to Rick. Okay, this is where Rick stops the RV and he gets on the radio. And first he tries to talk to Glenn and says that he's ahead of the herd in place as far as he can guess. He's not sure exactly where the herd is, but he's waiting for it to arrive so that he can start leading it away. He tries to raise Glenn, he tries to raise Michonne, but nobody's answering. And the only one who's actually hearing him and answers is Daryl, who is driving around on his bike. And at this point, Daryl is, I don't even know that he's specifically looking for Rick. He's just heading back toward Alexandria to help because Rick said, there's a horn, something's going on. So Daryl's just headed back, right? Um, so then Rick starts talking on the radio. He says there's gunfire coming from back home. Uh, but basically talking about how they have to stay the course. And he says, they can handle it. We've got to keep moving forward and that this is for them, for all the people that they're trying to keep safe. And he says, we can't turn back because we're afraid, to which Abraham says, we ain't afraid. And then, okay, so Rick says, this is for them. Going back before it's done, that'd be for us. Basically, he's saying that staying the course to make this happen and get the walkers away from Alexandria, that's what he's talking about. And that is keeping their family members safe. And uh, if they're staying out there to do this, and basically he's saying if we gave up on this and ran home to help them, that would be for us, but this is for them, right? This, okay, there's several different ways I could go go about this and interpret this. Um, when he says this is for them, that line caught my attention immediately the first time I watched this because it sounds very similar to what he said about Beth when he is, at the beginning of 509 when he's saying Beth wanted to get Noah home, this is for her. And it's almost exactly the same, only he's saying this is for them, right? Um, but I do think that this also goes back to what I've talked about, in the last video too, about not being in survival mode. Like he's saying, no, they can handle what's going on back there. We need to follow through on this to protect our people. If they just run back to see what's going on, that's much more reactive. That's more survival mode. So I think that's what he's trying to say. We need to stay the course and get this done and trust that the people back home can handle what's happening back home, right? I always felt that there was a parallel in the way he worded that, and that is another thing that I will come back to. What I think this all means. And you guys, I know you're probably really annoyed with me saying that over and over again, but I want to go through the whole thing because then you have to look at this as a whole arc and a whole template. So I promise it'll make sense when I get there. Okay, then we have a bunch of the wolves. It's the same ones that Morgan let live and let go. And they show up at the RV and attack Rick. They open the door and shoot at him. And when they first fire at him, we do see these sparks under the steering column, right? So that first gunfire basically ruins the RV. It basically fries the electrical system. And when he tries to start it again, it won't work. Now, there's a lot of significant symbolism going on here. I've already said many times that Rick is a Beth parallel. And this is one of the ways that we know it's from this scene. I'll go back and show you other places, but in general, okay, so it's important that the wolves who attack Rick here are the ones that Morgan let go. Because he didn't kill these wolves, they attacked Rick, right? And in a way, that did get them into trouble because if Rick had been able to lead the walkers away with the RV, they might not have ever ended up back at Alexandria, but that didn't go so well, right? We're going to see that they do end up back at Alexandria because this doesn't work. Because they attacked him here, none of that happened, and all of the walkers ended up around the gates of Alexandria. So this was Rick's plan, and it's really the second one that failed, right? The first one just that the horn went off and they pulled the back half of the herd off the road. That was the first problem. And then Rick was going to lead them away with the RV, but these wolves attacked him and basically killed the engine of the RV. So then this plan didn't work. I think that this has, we could relate this to the battery theory. Like, I think it was more than just the battery that was fried, when they shot up the RV, but in the sense that the car is not starting, right? Because there's something wrong with it. And from a very, very high level view, we can even say that the RV kind of represents Beth. That may sound a little bit ridiculous, but think about it. The bullets put it out of commission and it wouldn't start again. So it's something like that. You the RV, quote unquote, died. And then because of a bullet, they couldn't get it to wake up again, right? He couldn't get it to start again. And we've always said that with the battery theory, it is symbolic of not being able to get Beth to wake up. But I think they use that because it's like when a car needs a battery, it's not a complete lost cause. You don't junk the car just because it needs a battery. You can go find a battery and get it started again. And we actually saw them do that at the gas station in 4A, which I think was a total foreshadow and an example of that symbolism. So I'm just saying that they're doing that here, right? So what happens here? After killing the first wolf that attacked him, Rick also finds the bottle of carrots in his pocket. Daryl hears this and gets really freaked out, right? Because he thinks Rick is being attacked, which he is. But here's Rick fighting with this first wolf, and then Daryl being frustrated because he doesn't know exactly where Rick is. He's just on one of these back roads somewhere. But then Rick does triumph over this wolf and finds the carrots. But then he sees the rest of the wolves. This is not a clear picture, but they're coming up in the side view mirror here. You can see them. So he just opens fire, starts shooting the side of the RV, and manages to kill them all, right? We start to see the herd arriving. So it probably would have arrived anyway. He was sitting there waiting for it, but I'm sure the gunfire drew it even more. But then he tries to start the car and it won't start, right? He can't get the RV to start. It won't work. The end of the episode just kind of zooms out and you can see that the herd is arriving around the car or around the RV. So they're starting to converge on him. And then we actually don't see what happens next. What we do see in the next episode is him arrive back at Alexandria yelling, "Open the gate." So he does get in and they open the gate and he's okay, but we just have to assume that at some point he got out of the RV and just started running because there was nothing else to do, right? So I was thinking in some strange way, he actually kind of led the walkers back to Alexandria because they would have been following him at that point. They were headed that way anyway, so they probably would have ended up there anyway, but they were following him at that point. But without the RV to lead them in a different direction, they were going to end up there, right? So it just didn't work to divert them the way that he wanted to. But hopefully you can kind of see what I mean here. Not only did the RV take a bullet to the electrical system and then it wouldn't start again, but Rick had to abandon it and leave it behind in the woods. And it was surrounded by walkers when he did. So that's very specific to what we think happened with Beth. But you can also see Rick directly as a Beth symbol here because he was in the car and he was alone and he was surrounded by walkers and he was trying, I even think it's interesting that they have him trying to talk to people on the radio and no one will answer. So it feels very isolated, like he's alone and might be talking to himself, but the only one who can hear him is Daryl. And I even think that could be symbolic because Daryl's searching for him here. And we think that Daryl searched for Beth, after they left her in the car. Of course, at this point, Daryl starts specifically trying to find Rick because he hears the gunfire, like I said, and he's worried and upset and trying to find Rick, but he can't find him. But it's almost, like Rick equals Beth here. And it's interesting that only Daryl could hear him on the radio. We've said many times that we think, in the future, Daryl might hear Beth's voice on the radio first in some way, but not be able to find her or know where she is. So it's both a callback and possibly a foreshadow. And it's going to be really interesting if at however Daryl ends up finding Beth, if he does hear her on the radio in some capacity and doesn't know where she is, it would just be a very obvious payoff for the symbolism. So let's talk really quickly about Abraham's truck parallel, just to show you that we've seen this before. Back in season 4, when we first met Abraham and Rosita and Eugene, Abraham is fighting with Glenn and walkers come. So Eugene grabs a gun, which he does not know how to use, and starts firing at the walkers. And he kills Abraham's big truck. I think Abraham even says that at some point, "You killed the truck." And I remember watching that before and wondering if it might be a foreshadow of Beth getting shot. That did occur to me before, but I also thought, maybe I'm reaching with that. So I really wasn't sure. But the point is, he shoots holes in the truck and then it won't start again, and they have to abandon that truck. So, after seeing this several times, I don't think I am reaching with that. I think they use the symbolism a lot of the car not working and having to leave it uh, behind, basically. So I think that's why we see the exact same thing here with the RV. Now, of course, at the end of this episode, we do see Daryl suddenly rejoin Sasha and Abraham. And I probably don't need to go over that again because I've talked about it before fairly recently, but we aren't told why he changed his mind. And that's always been very strange to me because the last thing we saw before this shot where he rejoins them is him freaking out about Rick. And he seems to be searching and he seems to be very motivated to search, right? And then it's like all of a sudden he just abandoned that search and went back to Sasha and Abraham. And I remember watching this going, well, wait a minute. Why did he do that? And I mean, yeah, because Sasha gave him crap for leaving, and this was what he was supposed to do. He's returning to the job he was given, but we don't get his logic for why he decided to do that, right? We don't know why he made that choice. And it goes back to, we saw this kind of thing in uh, Find Me, where he's out in the woods and suddenly just changes his mind and goes back to write the note for Leah. I think it does go back to the what changed your mind symbolism, which is a Beth thing. Um, and also remember that somebody asked Norman about this in an interview about this episode specifically, 603, and why Daryl decided to go back. So clearly it wasn't just me that was like, hey, they didn't tell us that. What's going on there? There were other fans that wanted to know what Daryl's mindset was and why he made that decision. And Norman didn't really answer them. All he said was that it wasn't just about Rick. There was a lot more that went into it than that. So, and he made it seem like I can't talk about that more because, it's spoilery and you'll find out eventually. But, they never really returned to this. And so, what I take away from that is that it does have to do with Beth. It does have to do with a lot that is symbolic rather than what is literally happening in this arc. And Norman knows exactly what it is, and that it has to do with the missing 17 days. And he knows exactly what Daryl's mindset is, and he's not able to tell us, so that's really significant too. So we get to episode 5. I really jumped very quickly through episodes 5 through 7. I did skip 4 and 6, remember? And don't get me wrong, I'm sure if you went through 5 and 7 with a fine-tooth comb, you would find a lot of symbolism that backs all of this up. But, a lot of it, like I said, is interpersonal stuff between characters and logistical things that I just wasn't quite as interested in. So in episode 5, Rick returns to Alexandria, and he ends up giving his speech to the scared Alexandrians, where he says, the wall is going to hold together, will you? And to be fair, the walls really did hold. He was right about that. They came down because the church fell on them. But that was not because the walls folded, it was because of the church. Of course, we have this always cracked me up, and I think people were making a lot of jokes about this when it happened because we have Carl and Ron fighting, and it was really, it was not a punch you in the face sort of fight like, Daryl and Rick would have. It was kind of a teenage slap fight, so it was kind of funny. We do also see Betsy has killed herself. And then, of course, we have Maggie and Aaron trying to leave, which they don't end up doing, but she tells him she's pregnant. Carl wanted to go find Enid. That's what the fight between him and Ron was. And Ron doesn't want to. And then, of course, we have Denise becoming a little bit more confident in herself as a doctor. She's able to save Scott. And mostly this episode, other than that, is just people waiting around to see if the others are going to return. So they're waiting for Daryl and Sasha and Abraham to come back and to hear from Glenn. And, Michonne is back and told everyone what happened, but it's a waiting game. It's very much a waiting game. Then, of course, there's episode 6, which I'm not going to go into. This one had a ridiculous amount of Beth symbolism in it, but it was a side mission, right? So, the one thing I will mention is that remember that Daryl finds the Patty truck, and there is a walker in the front seat. So we do have some of the same imagery that I've been talking about, but again, we're not going to go into that too much. So then we have episode 7, which is Heads Up, and of course, this is important because Glenn is revealed to be alive, which is also a Beth thing. Again, you guys, I've said this a million times, but back when this was going on, I really was not at all convinced that Glenn was dead, but I literally said, I could probably go back and find it on my account a long time ago, so I'd have to dig for it, but I literally said, okay, look, I don't know if Glenn is alive or not, but if he is dead, then Team Delusional is screwed. Like, because all of the symbolism that was around him was the same stuff that was around Beth. So if he's dead, then yeah, probably Beth's dead, you know. If he's alive, then that also correlates to Beth. And what do you know? He was alive. Okay. He finds Enid. We do see a bird cage. So this is when he's chasing Enid through this building, and you see the bird cage right here. So we do see the bird cages a lot. We saw one in Beth's cell. We saw one right before Connie disappeared. This is a symbol that we see around death fake outs and people who are gone for a long time but return. Now, in this case, we saw it after the fact, after Glenn came back, but I think there just wasn't a really good way to incorporate it before because it was just really high adrenaline and Glenn was running and all of that. Um, but we do see it here. Inside Alexandria, we see Maggie and Rick talking about Judith, looking like Lori. We see Rick teaching Ron to shoot. Morgan talks to Denise. And then we have the scene where Rick and Carol get after Morgan for letting the wolves go. So they kind of yell at him for it. And then Glenn finally catches up with Enid in this cafe. Now, the cafe is another one that has a lot of symbolism in it. It has like a fire truck that she's messing around with. You know, we could go into a lot of symbolism here, which I'm not going to do. But the fire truck is exactly like the one we see in Sam's room later in 608, and that we saw Abraham driving in season 5 uh, when Beth disappeared. There's a lot of broken glass in here, old desiccated cakes, which are obviously like an indication of death. There's just a lot of rotting food. It's got to smell great in there, you know. And eventually, Glenn, they argue, but Glenn makes Enid go with him. And they eventually are going to reach the green balloons. This part where he asks, "Why did you give me water?" jumped out at me. Or he asks Enid this, "Why did you give me water?" And she says, "Look, I had it, you needed it, you know." She just kind of plays it off. But for some reason, what this reminded me of was 510 and Aaron showing up to give them, you know, Team Family water. If you think about it, they're correlated with resurrection, right? So we find out that Glenn is alive. You know, he crawls out from under the dumpster. Yay, he's alive. And then she gives him water. In 510, we don't see the actual resurrection, but we have, you know, who we later find out is Aaron and his boyfriend giving them water. And then the music box wakes up, which is a resurrection symbol. And we know that water has something to do with Beth and something to do with the CRM. So you see what I mean? That's why this jumped out at me. I was like, okay, so we've got a correlation here between water and the resurrection symbols and the person being alive who everybody thought was dead. You get the idea. So they eventually reach the green balloons and they're heading back to Alexandria. Now, here's the thing. I'm starting to become a broken reckoner about this, but I do think that Glenn and Enid are something of a Bethyl proxy here. Not only because clearly Glenn is alive and was thought to be dead, so there's that obvious thing, but they're not too happy with each other at first. They're pretty surly with each other, and we just see a lot of Beth symbolism around them. I mean, the fact that there's the green balloons and they go into the church when they get back. I mean, we could go on and on. But even the fact that they don't entirely like each other at first, it just kind of reminds me of Beth and Daryl in Still when they were kind of being surly with each other at first, and then eventually, you know, things get better. They start to trust each other more. They do eventually make it back to Alexandria and are way shocked because the back half of the herd is now surrounding Alexandria, which is exactly what they did not want to happen. And they're going, oh crap, okay, what are we going to do now, basically? So they had not realized that this had happened. So once again, this is an example of how Enid left because of the wolves. She didn't know what was going down with the walkers. And Glenn didn't know, you know, that the walkers had come back here. He was hoping that Rick had led them away. So we're getting a lot of shock as people kind of converge and realize what's been going on this whole time. So then we have this really strange side thing where Spencer tries to leave and it doesn't work. He says that he's going to go try and get help or maybe lead the walkers away himself. I think he says that he wanted to go get one of the cars that's outside the walls and try to lead them away. So theoretically, he was trying to help, but it doesn't work. The whatever you call this line, the string that he's using breaks, and he almost gets eaten by the walkers who are down there. And there's all these people trying to get him to come back and saying he's doing things that are dangerous. And Tara tries to help him. and she almost gets killed, and it's just kind of a messy situation. But the reason I'm bringing this up, first of all, he has this green strap across his chest, and I always wondered, I always thought that stood out, and that maybe they're trying to tell us something. Like I wondered if he was a Beth proxy because of this green strap. But more than that, when he is trying to come up, he loses his shoe. Okay, and this, even if it's not a direct Beth proxy, I've talked about the lost shoe symbolism lots of times before. We see a lost shoe just before, usually before two people are separated. So it's a little bit like the birdcage. We usually see it right before a big separation. We did see it around Beth and Daryl. They saw the shoe. It wasn't one of their shoes, but they saw the missing shoe at the train tracks in Inmates, I think that was. And we saw a lost shoe just before Al and Isabel met, and then they were separated. So we've seen this plenty of times before. And so it's odd that they're doing this with Spencer because it's actually really hard to nail down exactly what they're going for here. Because Spencer was not a well-liked character, and he doesn't really have a romance with anyone. We do know that he and Rosita hooked up, but that was way after this. And anyway, so this was just, it was such a random thing to have happen. I don't know, maybe they're just trying to give us another replay, another way to throw the symbolism in. This is also where Rick yells at Tara for helping Spencer, and it really is because Rick likes Tara and she almost died, but she flips him off. So we always said, oh, there's another little Beth thing. It's the flip off there. And it's kind of funny. Just think of it this way. He was doing something dangerous, Spencer was, and he lost his shoe, which represents separation from the people you love. He basically fell into a horde of walkers and almost died, but they pulled him out in time so that he didn't. I also think this might have been them trying to draw attention to the shoe symbolism because he specifically looks right at the camera and says, I lost my shoe. So anyway, I'm not at all sure what the point of that sequence is, but I do think that it's Beth symbolism on some level and that it's significant. So then we see Carol sees Morgan and Denise head off together, and she is suspicious, right? She knows Morgan is up to something, so she gives Judith to Jesse, which also makes Jesse a Beth proxy because she's taking care of Judith. Then pretty soon after that, they see the green balloons right here, and realize that Glenn is alive, and then the church decides to fall and collapse. All right. I made a note here that there's a theme of what was burnt is what gets them into trouble, right? So we had the feed store with Glenn and Nicholas, and because it had already been burnt sometime in the past, they couldn't use it for what they wanted to, and they ended up in trouble and surrounded by walkers. And then we have kind of the same thing here with the church. It had been partially burnt when the truck hit it, and also knocked down, and there was just the fact that the truck hit it, it messed with the structure stability, and so maybe it was going to fall anyway. But when Michonne and Heath come back to the community, you can actually see that a large part of the church was burned while the wolves were there. A lot of it's just charred and black, and when it fell, it was unsteady and it fell over the wall and it let the walkers in. So once again, what was burned got them into trouble, and now they're surrounded by walkers. The walkers are getting into Alexandria. So there's a theme going on there, and I think it can probably be related back to Beth and Daryl in the Moonshine Shack. We've said a lot of times before that something about that got somebody's attention. Maybe they really weren't being tracked before that, and because they burnt down the Moonshine Shack, that brought them to somebody's attention, whether it was the Grady cops or someone else, the CRM. So what was burnt got them into trouble. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more near the end of this when I actually start giving you more of my theories. But let's go through the last couple of episodes here. We then get to episode 8, and I watched pretty much all of episode 8 and 9. We had the drawings that Sam is doing, especially these ones here. We tend to call them the Beth drawings. This looks like the cabin where Emily was filming for those missing 17 days. And this, I always thought it was a dinosaur. Now I think it's a dragon, especially with some of the stuff that we've seen during Daryl Dixon season 3 and what Norman was posting about the constellations and things. This one in the middle, there's been a few different theories about what it is, and I think I have talked about this before. Some people say it's the Big Dipper. I actually think it's a baby bassinet with kind of something dark leaning over it, which sounds creepy, but we see child symbolism a lot around Beth, and even like a darkness around it. We see that around Denise, just not too many episodes after this. But either way, I mean, whether it is the Big Dipper or a baby bassinet, I'm fine with it being either one because both of them could be symbols of Beth in some way. And then, of course, there's this cabin with the red car in front of it. So all of those are important, and I even think they might be sequential. We also see other things that are going on in Alexandria. We see Carol running. She falls down. She picks up some bullets. We see Tara, Eugene, and Rosita end up in a garage. And Morgan brought Denise down to help this wolf guy. So that's why, I said Carol was looking at them suspiciously. He was asking Denise as a doctor to come take a look at this guy, but then he left her with this guy when the church fell because he went to see what was happening. So he and Carol end up in a brownstone together because there's so many, everybody has to scatter and get inside because there's so many walkers in the streets. So Denise is down here with this guy, and the two of them are alone. Now, this is another thing that really jumps out at me. We know that Denise is a proxy, and it doesn't become quite as obvious until later on in episode 14, right? So we weren't entirely looking at her as a proxy at this point, but in hindsight, we can see that she was. But you can even say that she was left behind in a small way or abandoned by Morgan here. So she finds herself with a man that she's afraid of, who's an enemy, right? So the one thing that really caught my attention is he tells her that he's hurt, but you can tell she's afraid to get very close to him and actually look at his wound. So they kind of start having this philosophical conversation. She says, after everything you've done, do you really think that you still belong here? And he says, yeah, well, what do you think that I've done? And she says, you've killed people. And then he says this, he says, we free them. And then we were just going to use what was left. He says, I've done my part and the world will take care of the rest. It won't change. Okay, so the change theme is going to be a big deal here. What I mean is, and you'll see this as we go through this arc, because again, they're setting something up here that doesn't get paid off until the end of this episode when he dies. But the first thing that I want to point out is that they believe they're freeing people by killing them. And I always thought the wolves were really super fascinating villains. But this is something that this is a belief that they have shared with other villains. The Whisperers believe something similar to this, and the Primitivos, who we saw in Daryl Dixon season 3, the bandits, the bone helmet guys, also believe the same thing. Okay, and I don't know if they're going for different factions of people. Like, this is something that some people would just be given to believe because of the way the world is and because of the apocalypse and all that. But I know that Galadriel Jones has had more than one theory about some of these mercenary groups. Maybe they're all coming from the same place. Maybe they're all breaking off a bigger group. We just don't know because they don't seem to be related in the narrative, but that doesn't mean that they aren't in some way. Anyway, but the way that they set this up and then pay it off is talking about change. He says the world won't change. And then later on, he actually saves Denise from a walker, and she tells him that he did change. She says, look, you came back for me. You sacrificed yourself to save me, so you changed. So this harkens back to the change theory. And, Beth saying, I wish I could just change. And Daryl says you did. So it's about whether people can change based on their experiences. Is this guy always going to be just a um, brutal killer who doesn't care about people, or could somebody change him? Could some experience he has or some interaction with another human being change him? And what they're showing with this guy, even though he does die and he is a pretty minimalist villain, they're showing that his relationship with Denise, even though it was very short-lived, did change him. So this is important. I'm going to show you this as we go along. But what really names her more as a Beth proxy here is when she says, show me your wound. And he does. That is very, very close to what's your wound, which is what Morgan said to Rick in the pilot. But we also heard a lot of voices saying it in 904, which is the last episode before Rick disappeared into the CRM. And Beth was one of the voices who said it. Emily was. She says, what's your wound? And then Denise says, here, show me the wound. You see what I mean? How it's very similar. And just the way that they say it, it's not exact, of course, but to say wound like that, I mean, they could have said it any other way. She could have said, show me the injury or show me where you're hurt. They're matching it. They're trying to line up that dialogue. So I think that's important. Now, this is the wound, sorry, it's disgusting. And she looks more closely at it, right? And this is more of the change theory. She says, you weren't born this way, meaning she's trying to say that he was born good. He wasn't born a killer, right? You changed. You can change. Now, of course, um, creepy wolf dude, I always called him in the closed captioning, they call him W Man, I noticed. I always called him creepy wolf dude. He ends up taking her hostage and out into the walkers, which can parallel Beth being taken hostage, right? Um, and I actually thought this dialogue was interesting too. Remember that Tara and Eugene and Rosita show up. That's why he's pointing the gun at them. And Tara says, you don't need her, let her go. And he says, no, I don't need her, but he takes her anyway. And the reason that's significant is because he recognizes that he really doesn't need her as a hostage. Because of the walkers out there, what good is a hostage? You're going to run through the walkers and make it, or you're not. Um, but what that means is he wants her. He doesn't need her. He wants her. And that's interesting because of what I'm going to talk about next. So then I will come back to that. But we see, um, I've really skipped over this whole story because it's not terribly relevant. But remember that Rick and Michonne, Carl, Ron, Jesse, Deanna, the baby, of course. I think Father Gabriel's in there with them. Yeah, I think he is. They are all in Jesse's house, right? And we have Sam freaking out upstairs still, listening to the music. And they eventually know that in order to get through the walkers, they're going to have to put blood and guts all over them and walk through the herd, right? So this is what we're seeing them doing. This is the end of the episode, is getting up and walking out. I actually really love this ending. I really love the music. I think it's really well put together. Okay, and then we get into episode 8. Yeah, this is 9. Sorry. The other one was episode 8. So Denise is still Creepy Wolf Dude's hostage. Now, the biggest thing here, I don't remember exactly what my thoughts were about this while I was watching it, but um, in the Talking Dead after the episode, Nicotero gave us some really interesting clues, right? He was talking about this, and Chris, who was the host of The Talking Dead, said something like, and I'm totally paraphrasing here, I don't remember his exact words, but he basically said that this guy, Creepy Wolf Dude, was very intrigued by Denise. And he said something like, I don't want to say he was in love with her or anything, but he seemed very interested in her. And Nicotero actually told Chris he was wrong. And he said, no, no, actually, I think that's accurate. I think in his own twisted way, he was kind of in love with Denise. He was fascinated by her because he'd never met anyone like her before. And on the one hand, I mean, like I said, she was taken as his hostage. So this could be a throwback to Grady, just in the sense that, somebody bad took Beth hostage and she found herself in danger. But we didn't really see anybody who was obsessed with her in that or seemed to be in love with her. Yeah, I mean, there was Gorman, but it was kind of small potatoes. And he was definitely more lusting after her, right? Which I don't think Creepy Wolf Dude is doing here. There's not a whole lot that's really sexual about his interaction with Denise, but he does stare at her. I mean, if you look at her, he's staring at her in a way that would make most people uncomfortable. But again, it doesn't feel terribly sexual to me. He's just really, really intrigued by her. Of course, Beth made friends with Noah, but that wasn't a romantic thing. So the only way that I think that this could be specifically a parallel to Grady is if there was a whole hell of a lot that we did not see that went on at Grady. If there really was somebody who was obsessed with Beth there or something, and we just didn't see it. But I don't even think that that's the case. I mean, let's just say it is possible because we know that there was stuff they didn't tell us that was going on. Like that's obvious to all of us. And there were reports of Emily driving a cop car around the Grady parking lot, which we never saw on the show. So it's possible, but I just don't 100% think that's the case. I think that this is more of a foreshadow of something either that will happen when her and Daryl come back together, or maybe it happened in the interim sometime before or sometime between Coda and when they come back together. I mean, obviously we don't know. But I always thought that we would have a situation where there's going to be some evil guy who's like totally in love with Beth. And of course, it's not some sort of healthy, abiding love. It's more like obsession because it'll be someone who's really, really twisted. And I think that this is what they are foreshadowing here. And that's why Nicotero went out of his way to say, no, no, understand what was going on there, right? But it's important not only because this guy seems to be obsessed with her, but because, again, his relationship with Denise changes him. So it's a really interesting template. And I'm excited to see how it plays out. I won't go too much more into this, but Nicotero saying that really is important because Nicotero is the one who told us about the 17 days. He's the one who's made statements about Grady. I mean, he tells us stuff that has to do with Beth, even though um, it's not obvious, right? You know, of course, it's not obvious. He's not going to be able to tell us anything because under contract and they're keeping this a secret and all of that. But I believe I will have to check on this. I want to say he was the one that a member of TD talked to him and, you know, managed to say that they were hoping Beth would come back. And he's, again, I remember who I think this is, but I need to go get the story from her, so I'm saying it right. Basically, he said, "Don't worry, you're going to be happy." You know, so it was like almost a confirmation that maybe Beth would come back, but not really, you know, because of course they can't actually confirm it. So anyway, that's one of my this template with her and creepy wolf dude, even though it seems small and even though not that much happens, it's one of my favorite parts of season 6 because I feel like it's really a foreshadow of something that's going to happen with Beth, but we don't know exactly what that is. Um, so at some point, they do try to leave. He wants her to go up a ladder and over the wall, but a walker gets between her and the ladder, and so she stops. Then creepy wolf dude, because she stops, runs in front of her to kill that walker, and she starts fighting with another. I mean, there's just a lot of walkers in the road, right? So this is him turning around and seeing that she's in trouble. He comes back to help her and gets bitten on the arm. Okay. And then she says, "Get me to the infirmary. I can save your life." You know, she's obviously going to cut off his arm because that is something that they can save people from. And then they go into this room in between where they were in the infirmary. And he says, "The ladder was clear. We could have made it." And it's like he's even confused about why he stopped and why he came back and why that didn't work, right? And she says, "You turned back for me. Maybe you changed." So, again, just what I was saying before about the change template. Also, I didn't get a good picture of this, but the walker who stops Denise that she's fighting with is a one-eyed walker, so there is a serious hint there. Um, I also thought, you know, she's fighting in the road with this walker. She's literally out in the road fighting, which is exactly what Beth said at Grady. So there's a lot of little parallels there. So all of this is very Beth coded, and then Carol ends up shooting creepy wolf dude. That's when he dies. Um, and Denise does make it back to the medical building, just as Rick is bringing Carl in, who was shot in the eye. Right? So I haven't talked about that side of the story much. There is um, it was actually the previous episode in episode 8 we see Ron try to kill Carl, the whole thing in the garage, and the biggest thing there is that the garage is just full of symbolism, right? There are bikes, there are I mean there are all kinds of things that we usually see in a garage, but a lot of things that are used very often as Beth symbols. We have the glass breaking when the walkers try to come in, the fact that Carl, excuse me, is wearing his sheriff's hat, just a lot of it. And I'll come back to what I think all of this means, of course. It's made more interesting by the fact that Carl and Enid are a Beth and Daryl proxy. But anyway, eventually, like I said, they cover themselves in walker guts and they're going to have to walk out through the horde. Um, and of course, by this point, Deanna has been bitten, so she's staying behind upstairs. Carl is carrying Judith under his sheet that has the walker guts on it, yada yada. So um, everything seems to be going well at first. Father Gabriel takes Judith to the church and is going to stay there with some others from Alexandria. And Rick is saying they need to get to the quarry and get vehicles, but that's a long way. So a bunch of them are going to go, and Sam demands to stay with Jesse. But then, of course, when it gets dark, poor Sam, I mean, I know everybody hates him, but I mean, this kid is so traumatized. I feel bad for him. He starts to panic and freak out. And of course, we know that this leads to, you know, Jesse being killed. And then they turn around and Ron is getting ready to shoot Carl, but Michonne kills him. The gun goes off and Carl gets shot in the eye. Okay, so now we're caught up to where Rick brings him to Denise, right? And from there, we just have this huge fight in the street. So I always loved this whole sequence. I thought the end, remember I told you that the arc goes through episode 9. So this is the end of this arc. So you've got to see it as it starts with them. I mean, really, it starts in the flashbacks from episode 1, where They find the quarry and realize this is a problem. Then there's Operation Lead the Walkers Away. Um, they fail several times. The front half of the herd, actually, that part works because Daryl and Sasha and Abraham do lead the rest of that to 20 miles out and then circle back around. And when they're coming back, that's when they are being fired on by the saviors, and that's when always accountable happens, right? But in terms of leading the walkers away, the front half of the herd, it did work for. The back half was a fail because of the wolf horn, right? And then Rick tried to lead the walkers away, and then Glenn tried to start a fire to get the walkers' attention, and none of that worked. So all of the walkers ended up back at Alexandria, right? And so that's where we are at. They have this whole thing with Maggie being up on the scaffold that's going to fall and she's in danger. And we have Enid and Glenn outside. They go into the church. I didn't really go into much of that because there's a lot of symbolism in there too, but they're just trying to find a way to help Maggie and to, try to figure something out here. We also have uh, Daryl and Sasha and Abraham returning finally after everything that happened and always accountable. They meet the saviors on the road, they blow them up, which is a very satisfying scene, but I didn't go over that too much. So now they're on their way back. So it's all kind of culminating here, right? Glenn is trying to help Maggie, but then he becomes surrounded by walkers. And so they, his face, it looks like, again, that he is going to die. He's going to get eaten by walkers here. But Sasha and Abraham kill them all and say, hey, open the gate for us. And then Glenn gets in the car with Daryl, who says, geez, what the heck happened? But this is where they all go out into the street and start fighting the walkers, right? I forgot here. Of course, Daryl is going to blow up the pond. And so here's the other interesting thing I will point out is when Glenn gets into this truck with Daryl, and this is the Patty truck, by the way, he says, okay, well, let's use this truck or go get other vehicles and we'll lead them away from Alexandria. And then Daryl says, no, we don't have to. And it's because he has the gasoline in the truck and he knows he can blow up the lake. And that works, right? It brings most of the walkers into the lake who catch on fire, and the rest, the people there, just fight until they take them all out. And so that's why I always like this ending. It's a really good example of them working together. And unity is a really big theme, right? I don't think we talk about that enough, but unity, fighting together as a community or as a whole to keep each other safe, that's a huge theme in the Walking Dead universe. But what I wanted to point out was that they didn't, leading them away again, even though that was constantly their idea, okay, how can we lead them away, didn't end up being the ultimate solution here. It was ethanol and fire, which are both Beth symbols. So this is just different shots of them fighting, which are kind of hard to get. And then that's the end of the episode. We just see Rick talking to Carl, because he's afraid Carl's not going to survive, which he does. So you guys, that is pretty much the end of this arc. I will point out that, I was talking about Rick and how much he had changed. The change is a big deal. And the next thing we see after this is the next world, where we see him and Daryl going out looking for people and, them kind of being funny together, but they meet Jesus. And the point is that they've changed enough. Rick is not being isolationist anymore. He's going out looking for people. And so you can just see the arcs moving, but they move very slowly, right? We went from Rick being really savage, at the end of season 5. And then in this season, like I said, he had changed enough not to kill Carter. So he is not a savage anymore, but he was still telling Daryl, I don't want to go out and look for people. And then after this, the next arc, he's going out with Daryl to look for people. So you can see the way he's changing. But especially when we're watching that on TV or in the show, I mean, there's literally years in that one arc. It went from season 5 to season 6, and it's a long time, right? So it does move pretty slowly. All right, you guys, this video, once again, is long, and I'm going to cut off there. I know you're probably going to hate me for that, but in the next video, I'm finally going to bring it all together and show you what I think this means and all of that. So bear with me one more day, and then you'll finally get the payoff, I promise, okay? And if you are still watching this, if you watched the first one for a full hour and the second one, you're still here, then you are a rock star, and thank you for giving me your time, and I will pay it off in the next video, okay? So I will see you then.